Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where war consumes entire star systems and hope flickers like a dying candle, one figure stands at the precipice of an impossible choice. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, and one of the Emperor's own genetically crafted sons, bears a secret that would shake the foundations of human civilization. He is afraid. Not of the endless hordes of green-skinned invaders, not of the corrupted traitors who serve the dark gods, not even of the chittering swarms that devour entire worlds. No, the Lord Commander of the Imperium is afraid of his own father waking up. This fear runs deeper than simple apprehension. It cuts to the very core of who Guilliman is, what he believes, and what he has discovered about the being he once called father. To understand why one of the Emperor's most loyal sons would dread his awakening, we must journey through layers of revelation, disappointment, and horrifying truth. We must explore what Guilliman found when he finally stood before the Golden Throne after 10,000 years of absence. We must confront the possibility that the being humanity worships as a god might be something far worse than they imagine, or perhaps something they should fear more than any demon prince or alien warlord. The story begins not with fear, but with hope. When Guilliman was resurrected in the closing days of the 41st Millennium, brought back from the edge of death by a combination of ancient technology and the power of an alien god of the dead, he awoke to an Imperium that had decayed beyond recognition. The realm his father had built, the vision of human unity and enlightenment that had driven the Great Crusade, had transformed into a theocratic nightmare. Humanity cowered in the darkness, worshipping the Emperor as a god despite his explicit rejection of such worship. The Imperium had become everything the Emperor had fought against during the Unification Wars, everything he had sought to destroy across the galaxy. But Guilliman held on to hope. Surely, he thought, his father would explain. Surely there was a plan, a reason for allowing such degradation. The Emperor had always worked in mysterious ways, keeping his ultimate designs secret even from his Primarch sons. When Guilliman learned that terror still stood, that the Emperor yet endured upon the Golden Throne, he felt a surge of something he had not experienced in what felt like an eternity. Relief, purpose, direction. His father would guide him, would help him understand how to navigate this twisted version of the Imperium, would give him the wisdom needed to restore what had been lost. That hope died in the Imperial Palace's inner sanctum, in the presence of the Golden Throne itself. The journey to the throne. The pilgrimage to terror was no simple matter. Guilliman had to fight his way through the maelstrom itself, nearly being claimed by the warp for all eternity. His brother Magnus the Red, now a demon Primarch in service to Tzeentch, ambushed him on Luna, seeking to corrupt or destroy him before he could reach their father. The battles were apocalyptic, shaking the very foundations of humanity's homeworld. But Guilliman persevered, driven by that kernel of hope, that desperate need to speak with the Emperor and receive guidance in this dark age. As he approached the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace, walking corridors that had not seen a Primarch's footsteps in millennia, Guilliman prepared himself. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would describe the state of the Imperium, what questions he needed answered. He thought about his brothers, both loyal and traitor. He wondered if his father knew about the Primaris Space Marines, about Archmagos Call's 10,000-year project. He wondered if the Emperor would be pleased with how Guilliman had structured the Imperium after the heresy, with the Codex Astartes and the division of the legions. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden armored guardians, watched him pass with expressionless helms. They knew something Guilliman did not yet understand. They had stood watch over the Emperor for 10,000 years, had seen what time and agony had wrought upon the master of mankind. But they said nothing, simply allowed the Primarch to proceed toward his father's presence. The chamber of the Golden Throne is vast beyond mortal comprehension, a cathedral-sized space deep within the Imperial Palace's most secure regions. The throne itself dominates the space, a fusion of ancient Dark Age technology and psychic machinery that defies conventional understanding. Cables thicker than Space Marine battle tanks run from the throne into the palace's depths, carrying power and data in quantities that would overwhelm entire Forge worlds. The air itself feels heavy with psychic pressure, as if reality grows thin in this place, where one of humanity's mightiest psychers has sat for 10 millennia, and upon that throne sits a corpse. No amount of preparation could have readied Guilliman for what he saw. The Emperor's physical form had degraded far beyond what Guilliman remembered from the heresy's end. The being that had once strode among men in radiant golden armor, that had united terror and launched the Great Crusade, was now little more than a desiccated husk held together by technology and sheer force of will. The flesh had withered to almost nothing, leaving little more than a skeleton wreathed in the tattered remnants of once magnificent robes. The life support systems that kept this ravaged form functioning made mechanical sounds that echoed through the throne room like a death rattle that never ended. But it was not the physical decay that struck Guilliman most profoundly. It was the sense of presence, the psychic weight that emanated from the throne. The Emperor's consciousness had not diminished with his body's decay. If anything, it had grown, expanded, become something vast and terrible that touched the warp itself. Guilliman could feel it pressing against his mind, a force so immense that it made the psychic presence of greater demons feel like whispers in comparison. Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes stood beside Guilliman as he approached the throne. The leader of the Emperor's guardians had seen many pilgrims come before the Golden Throne over the millennia, but never one with the right to actually communicate with the Emperor. Psychers could sense the Emperor's will through the Astronomicon, through the Emperor's tarot, through dreams and visions. But direct communication was something else entirely, something that required a mind powerful enough to withstand the psychic pressure of the Emperor's consciousness. Guilliman was a Primarch, a demigod crafted by the Emperor's own hand. His mind had been designed to be resilient beyond mortal limits, to command armies across light years of space, to process tactical data at speeds that would overwhelm even the most sophisticated cogitators. Surely, he thought, he could endure whatever communion his father wished to share. He was wrong. The Emperor's consciousness struck Guilliman's mind with the force of a cyclonic torpedo. There was no gentle greeting, no acknowledgement of the son who had come so far to stand before his father. Instead, Guilliman was assaulted by a torrent of information, visions, and raw data that threatened to overwhelm even his enhanced cognition. He saw the Imperium as the Emperor perceived it, a view that spanned the entire galaxy in an instant, taking in every threatened world, every corrupted system, every point where the forces of chaos pressed against reality. The communion lasted only minutes by the measurements of Valoris and the custodians who stood witness. To Guilliman, it felt like hours, days, perhaps even years. When it ended, when the psychic pressure finally released him, the Primarch collapsed to his knees, his enhanced physiology struggling to recover from the experience. His hands shook, his breath came in ragged gasps, and worst of all, his hearts felt like they had been frozen in his chest. Valoris later claimed that Guilliman had been in silent psychic conversation with the Emperor, that he had received enlightenment and guidance. Guilliman's own memory of the event was different, fragmented, as if his mind had protected itself from the full weight of what had occurred. But certain truths had burned themselves into his consciousness, truths he could not forget no matter how much he might wish to. The Emperor had not asked how Guilliman was, had not welcomed him home, had not expressed relief that one of his loyal sons had returned. There had been no warmth, no recognition of the relationship they had once shared, however limited it might have been. Instead, the Emperor had simply provided Guilliman with data, with strategic imperatives, with the tasks that needed to be accomplished. The Primarch had been assessed, found functional, and deployed like any other tool in the emperor's arsenal. Guilliman had gone seeking a father and found only a master who saw him as an implement to be used. The emperor as he was. To understand the depth of Guilliman's disappointment and fear, we must examine what he remembered of his father, what relationship existed between them before 10,000 years of separation transformed everything. The emperor of mankind had been many things during the Great Crusade. To the common people of Terra and the newly united worlds of humanity, he was a figure of legend, a golden giant who led armies to victory and brought the light of human civilization to darkened corners of the galaxy. To the Space Marine legions, he was the ultimate commander, the architect of their purpose, and the source of their genetic inheritance. To the Primarchs, he was father, creator, and absolute authority, though the nature of that relationship varied wildly depending on the son in question. Guilliman had been one of the fortunate ones, if such a word could be used. When the Emperor had found him on Macragge, Guilliman had already been ruling that world for years, having transformed it from a struggling empire into a prosperous and well-defended realm. The Emperor had been impressed with what his son had accomplished, and their early relationship had been marked by mutual respect. Guilliman had been given command of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, and had thrown himself into the Great Crusade with characteristic efficiency and dedication. Unlike some of his brothers, Guilliman had not craved the Emperor's approval or affection. He understood, even then, that the Emperor was working toward goals that transcended personal relationships. The Emperor had created the Primarchs for a purpose, and Guilliman had accepted that purpose without the emotional neediness that plagued some of his brothers. He was content to serve, to build, to bring worlds into compliance, and leave them better than he had found them. His relationship with his father was professional, built on shared goals rather than familial warmth. But even within that professional relationship, there had been moments of connection. The Emperor had spoken to Guilliman about his vision for humanity, about the Webway project that would free mankind from dependence on warp travel, about the future where humanity would become a fully psychic race while protected from the predations of chaos. These conversations had been rare, but they had shown Guilliman that his father did, in his own way, care about the future he was building. The Emperor's methods were harsh, his demands absolute, but they served a purpose that Guilliman could understand and support. The imperial truth that the Emperor preached had resonated deeply with Guilliman's rational mind. The idea that humanity should reject superstition and religious belief, that it should embrace reason and scientific understanding, aligned perfectly with how Guilliman had governed Macragge and how he approached every problem. When the Emperor had ordered Guilliman to accompany him to Kor to witness the humiliation of Lorgar and the word-bearers for their religious practices, Guilliman had understood why. Religion was a tool of division, of irrationality, of the very chaos that threatened humanity. It had to be suppressed, eliminated, replaced with reason. Guilliman had watched as the Emperor forced Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel through psychic power, as he had reprimanded them for building monuments to his worship, for spreading the belief that he was a god. The Emperor's words had been clear and unambiguous. He was not a god. He did not want worship. Such beliefs were dangerous and counter to everything the Imperium was meant to represent. Guilliman had agreed completely, had even felt a certain satisfaction seeing the word-bearers brought to task for their irrational devotion. That memory now haunted him with bitter irony. The Emperor had also shown Guilliman another side of his nature during the heresy itself, when the Webway project was sabotaged by Magnus the Red's desperate warning about Horus's betrayal. The Emperor had been forced to remain on the Golden Throne, fighting a never-ending battle against demonic incursion. He could not lead his armies, could not command the defense of the Imperium directly. He had been trapped, forced to delegate authority he would have preferred to keep. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and the second most powerful human psyker to ever live, had held the throne briefly to allow the Emperor to confront Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. That decision had killed Malcador, the strain of holding back the demon tide proving too much even for him. The Emperor had known this would happen, had made the decision anyway, because defeating Horus was deemed more important than the life of his most trusted friend. It was a calculation, a strategic necessity, but it revealed something about how the Emperor viewed even those closest to him. Guilliman had understood these things even then. He had accepted that the Emperor made hard choices, that leading humanity required a certain detachment from individual suffering. But he had believed, perhaps naively, that somewhere beneath the tactical calculations and strategic imperatives, his father still possessed a core of humanity, of compassion for those he led and those he had created. The encounter at the Golden Throne had shattered that belief completely. The thing on the Golden Throne. The being that had communicated with Guilliman in the throne room bore only the faintest resemblance to the Emperor he remembered. 10,000 years of agony, 10,000 years of psychic battle against the forces of chaos, 10,000 years of maintaining the Astronomicon and holding shut the breached webway portal had transformed the Emperor into something that could barely be called human. The physical decay was the least of it. Guilliman had seen horrific injuries before, had witnessed space marines fighting on despite wounds that would have killed normal humans 100 times over. The Emperor's physical state was shocking, certainly, but it was not what had struck fear into the Primarchs' hearts. It was what the Emperor had become mentally, psychically, spiritually, that filled Guilliman with dread. The Emperor's consciousness had grown vast and terrible. His mind now touched the warp itself, his psychic presence so immense that it formed a golden sun in the Imperium, a light that guided ships across the galaxy through the Astronomicon. This was power beyond what the Emperor had possessed during the Great Crusade, power that approached the level of the Chaos Gods themselves. Some believed the Emperor was becoming a god not through worship, but through his own psychic evolution, growing stronger with each passing century as he consumed the souls of 1,000 psykers every day to sustain his existence. But with that power had come a complete loss of patience, of compassion, of anything that might be called human feeling. The Emperor had been cold during the Great Crusade, his affections limited, and his priorities always focused on the larger picture rather than individual concerns. But he had still possessed some capacity for personal connection, however shallow. The being on the Golden Throne had stripped away even that pretense. When the Emperor communicated with Guilliman, there was no acknowledgement of their relationship, no recognition of Guilliman as a son or even as a particularly valued servant. The Emperor saw Guilliman exactly as he saw every other component of the Imperium's war machine, as a tool to be utilized, an asset to be deployed where it could do the most good. The psychic communion had conveyed strategic information, assignments, imperatives. It had not conveyed love, or pride, or even basic concern for Guilliman's well-being after millennia in stasis. One moment in particular had burned itself into Guilliman's memory with devastating clarity. Among the flood of visions and data, he had glimpsed the Emperor's perspective on the Primarchs themselves. They were weapons, nothing more. Genetically crafted instruments designed for specific purposes during the Great Crusade and the conquest of the galaxy. Some were hammers meant to break enemy resistance through pure force. Others were scalpels designed for precision operations. Guilliman had been the administrator, the builder, the one who could take conquered worlds and transform them into functioning parts of the Imperium. Each Primarch had been designed with particular traits, particular strengths and weaknesses, all calculated to serve the Emperor's purposes. Their personalities, their beliefs, their very souls had been crafted just as surely as their physical forms. And the Emperor had never, not for one moment, viewed them as actual sons. They were his creations, his property, his tools. The affection he had shown them, the pride he had expressed in their accomplishments, had all been calculated to ensure their loyalty and maximize their effectiveness. The revelation should not have been surprising. Guilliman had always known, on some level, that the Primarchs were created rather than born, that they existed to serve the Emperor's grand design. But knowing something intellectually is different from having it driven into your consciousness by the entity that created you, from feeling his absolute indifference to you as anything other than a useful implement. The Emperor did not love his sons. He could not afford to love them. Love was a weakness, a distraction from the endless work of guiding humanity toward its destiny. The Emperor had spent 40,000 years working toward his goals, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, had seen empires that made the Imperium look primitive by comparison turn to dust. He had lived through ages that would have driven lesser beings mad with their scope and horror. And somewhere along that journey, he had burned away everything soft, everything vulnerable, everything human. What remained was pure purpose, pure will, a consciousness focused entirely on survival and dominance. Guilliman had emerged from the throne room understanding, perhaps for the first time, what the Emperor truly was. Not a man who had become more than human, but something that had long ago ceased to be human at all. The Emperor was a god in the making, a psychic entity that happened to be bound to the corpse of a man who had once walked Terra's surface 40 millennia ago. And that entity viewed all of humanity, including his Primarch sons, as pieces on a board, to be sacrificed or preserved as strategy dictated. This understanding explained so much about the Great Crusade and the heresy that followed. The Emperor's lies to his sons about the nature of chaos, his refusal to explain his webway project or his true plans, his apparent favoritism towards some Primarchs over others, all of it made sense when viewed through the lens of someone managing tools rather than raising sons. Horus had fallen to chaos, in part because he felt the Emperor had betrayed him, had abandoned the crusade to pursue godhood while leaving his sons to fight and die without him. The truth was even more devastating. Horus had simply outlived his usefulness in the Emperor's plan. Guilliman wondered how many of his brothers had suspected this truth. How many had glimpsed the cold calculation behind their father's golden mask? Magnus had certainly known, his psychic nature allowing him to perceive the Emperor's true thoughts more clearly than most. Perhaps that knowledge had made it easier for him to betray the Imperium, to throw his lot in with Tzench when the Emperor's plans shattered. If your creator views you as nothing more than a tool, what loyalty do you truly owe him? The most horrifying aspect of this revelation was not just what the Emperor had become, but what he had always been. The warm moments, the rare expressions of pride or approval, even the anger he had shown toward Lorgar's religious devotion, all of it had been performance. The Emperor was an actor playing the role of father and leader, wearing whatever mask the situation required to achieve his goals. And now, after 10,000 years of torture on the Golden Throne, he no longer bothered with such pretense. Guilliman had gone seeking guidance and had found only confirmation that he was, and had always been, alone. The Emperor did not care about his sons. He did not care about the trillions of humans who died in his name. He cared only about the grand plan, about shepherding humanity through the darkness until it could evolve into something capable of surviving without him. And if that required sacrificing every Primarch, every Space Marine, every world in the Imperium, the Emperor would not hesitate to make that sacrifice. This was the first component of Guilliman's fear. He had met his father and discovered a being of such cold calculation, such absolute indifference to individual suffering, that it defied comprehension. If this was what the Emperor had become while bound to the Golden Throne, what would he become if he somehow broke free? What would an awakened Emperor, transformed into a warp god with all his power unleashed, do to the Imperium and the galaxy? The religion that should not exist. If discovering his father's true nature had been Guilliman's only shock, he might have found a way to accept it and move forward. After all, he had always been pragmatic, always willing to do what was necessary to preserve the Imperium. But his father's transformation was only one piece of a much larger nightmare. The other was the Imperium itself, and more specifically, the imperial cult that had consumed it. During the Great Crusade, the emperor had been absolutely clear in his rejection of religious belief. The imperial truth that he preached was fundamentally atheistic, declaring that there were no gods, no supernatural powers deserving of worship, only natural forces that science had not yet fully explained. Religion was viewed as one of humanity's greatest weaknesses, a source of division and irrationality that had led to countless wars throughout human history. The emperor had made it his mission to stamp out religious belief wherever it was found, to replace superstition with reason. Guilliman had witnessed this mission firsthand on countless worlds. Imperial forces would arrive on a planet, defeat its defenders, and then begin the process of integration into the Imperium. This always included suppressing the local religions, tearing down temples, and re-educating the population in the imperial truth. It was not always gentle. Worlds that clung too tightly to their gods often found those gods smashed to rubble along with their civilizations. But it was deemed necessary, a harsh measure required to protect humanity from the dangers of faith. The destruction of Monarchia remained one of the most vivid examples in Guilliman's memory. Lorgar's word-bearers had transformed that city into a monument to the emperor's worship, filling it with cathedrals and shrines, making it a pilgrimage site for those who believed in the emperor's divinity. The emperor's response had been absolute. He had ordered the city destroyed, its monuments reduced to ash and rubble. He had then forced Lorgar and the entire word-bearers' legion to kneel in that ash while he reprimanded them for spreading the very belief that would later consume the Imperium. Guilliman had stood beside his father during that reprimand, had heard the emperor's words clearly. "I am not a god," the emperor had declared, his psychic power forcing the word-bearers to prostrate themselves. "I reject such worship. It is a poison, a corruption of reason that I will not tolerate." The message had been unambiguous. The emperor wanted to be understood as an incredibly powerful human being, perhaps even a unique form of life, but definitely not as a deity deserving of worship. Now, 10,000 years later, Guilliman had awakened to discover that the entire Imperium worshipped the emperor as the one true god of humanity. The imperial cult, directly descended from the teachings Lorgar had spread before his fall to chaos, had become the state religion of the Imperium. Billions upon billions of human beings prayed to the emperor every day, begging for his protection, offering their devotion, believing absolutely that he was divine. Every world had its cathedrals, its priests, its ceremonies dedicated to the emperor's worship. The irony was so cruel it almost made Guilliman laugh. Lorgar, who had been punished for spreading belief in the emperor's divinity, had been vindicated by history. His book, the Lectitio Divinitatis, which the emperor had ordered burned and suppressed, had become the founding text of the imperial cult. The word-bearers' religious practices, which had earned them such scorn from their fellow legions during the crusade, had been adopted by the entire Imperium. And the emperor, who had explicitly rejected godhood, was now worshipped by more people than any deity in human history. Guilliman's first instinct had been to try to correct this. Surely, he thought, his return would allow him to remind the Imperium of the imperial truth, to restore the secular rationalism that his father had championed. He was a primarch, a son of the emperor himself. If anyone could speak with authority about what the emperor actually believed, it was Guilliman. His attempts met with failure that ranged from uncomfortable to dangerous. When he told imperial citizens that the emperor was not a god, that the emperor himself had explicitly rejected such worship, they simply did not believe him. The priests of the ecclesiarchy, the formal organization of the imperial cult, explained to him patiently that of course the emperor had denied his divinity during his mortal life, but that his ascension to the golden throne had transformed him into something greater. They claimed that the emperor had been testing humanity's faith, that his rejection of worship had been a way to separate true believers from false followers. Others took a different approach, suggesting that perhaps Guilliman had been deceived by the emperor during the Great Crusade, that the emperor had hidden his true divine nature even from his own sons. After all, the emperor had lied about many things, about the existence of chaos, about his plans for the webway, about his true purpose in creating the Primarchs. Why should anyone believe that his rejection of godhood was any more truthful than his other statements? The most disturbing responses came from those who suggested that Guilliman's refusal to acknowledge his father's divinity was itself a form of heresy. If a Primarch could not see what was obvious to every faithful imperial citizen, perhaps that Primarch's faith was lacking. Perhaps he had been tainted by his long sleep, or perhaps he had never truly understood his father the way ordinary humans did. These whispers were quiet, carefully modulated to avoid direct accusation, but Guilliman heard them nonetheless. The ecclesiarchy itself presented a more complex problem. The massive organization of the imperial cult wielded immense power within the Imperium, controlling vast resources and commanding the loyalty of billions. The Adepta Sororitas, the militant orders of the ecclesiarchy, were among the most effective fighting forces in the Imperium, their faith in the emperor granting them strength in battle. The missionaries of the ecclesiarchy worked on newly discovered human worlds, bringing them into the fold of the Imperium through the promise of the emperor's protection.
You know, thinking about this scenario really highlights one of the things I love most about Warhammer 40k. Here you have the Necrons, beings who gave up everything to become immortal machines, discovering a Primarch, something that represents the absolute peak of biological perfection fused with warp energy. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The irony of machine gods examining what they can never be again, while the Primarch embodies everything they sacrificed. It makes you wonder if, deep in their mechanical minds, there's some fragment of consciousness that looks at this being and feels something. Maybe not regret exactly, but recognition. Anyway, back to our story.
Guilliman quickly realized that destroying the imperial cult would mean tearing the Imperium apart. The faith in the emperor as a god had become the primary force holding human civilization together. Without it, the Imperium would fragment into countless warring factions, each claiming their own interpretation of what the emperor had wanted. The very thing his father had fought to prevent, religious division and conflict, would consume the Imperium if Guilliman tried to restore the imperial truth. Worse still, Guilliman had to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The faith of the imperial cult might actually be protecting humanity from chaos. The power of belief in the warp was real, undeniable. When billions of humans prayed to the emperor, when they offered their faith and devotion, that belief had psychic weight. It created a counterbalance to the worship of the chaos gods, a bulwark of human faith that the entities of the warp could not easily penetrate. The emperor had been wrong. His imperial truth, his rejection of faith and worship, had been based on flawed assumptions about the nature of the warp and human psychology. Religion was not just a source of division and irrationality. It was also a weapon, a tool that could be used to fight against the very forces the emperor had sought to suppress. The imperial cult, for all its excesses and corruptions, provided ordinary humans with a psychological defense against chaos corruption that reason alone could never match. Guilliman found himself in an impossible position. He knew the emperor had rejected worship. He knew the imperial truth had been his father's deeply held belief, the philosophical foundation of the entire Great Crusade. But he also knew that trying to restore that truth would destroy the Imperium and potentially leave humanity vulnerable to chaos in ways it had never been before. The lie that his father was a god had become more useful, more protective, than the truth that he was merely an incredibly powerful human being. This realization filled Guilliman with a profound sense of betrayal and hypocrisy. Everything his father had fought for, everything the emperor had demanded his son sacrifice to achieve, had been undone by necessity. The secular imperium of reason had died, replaced by a theocracy that would have appalled the emperor of the Great Crusade. And Guilliman, one of the emperor's most loyal sons, was now forced to maintain that theocracy, to allow the worship to continue, to tacitly accept the lie, simply because the Imperium could not survive the truth. The most bitter irony was that Lorgar had been right all along. The word-bearer's Primarch had always insisted that the Emperor was worthy of worship, that faith in him would save humanity. Lorgar had been punished for these beliefs, had been forced to watch his greatest achievements burn to ash, had been humiliated before his entire legion. And then he had turned to chaos, becoming one of the arch-traitors of the heresy, in part because his faith had been rejected. But history had proven Lorgar correct. The Emperor was worshipped by the Imperium. That worship did provide strength against chaos. Faith in the Emperor did save human souls from corruption. Everything Lorgar had preached at Monarchia had come to pass, just as he had predicted. The Emperor's attempt to suppress that faith had only delayed its inevitable rise. Guilliman wondered sometimes what would happen if Lorgar learned this truth. If the word-bearer's Primarch discovered that his original faith had become the foundation of the Imperium. Would it bring Lorgar satisfaction? Would it confirm his belief that he had always been right to worship the Emperor? Or would the corruption of chaos have progressed too far for such revelations to matter? These questions haunted Guilliman as he worked to lead the Imperium through crisis after crisis. He was forced to attend religious ceremonies, to allow priests to speak of him as the Emperor's holy son, to witness faith and devotion that he knew his father would have despised. He watched as miracles occurred, as living saints manifested the Emperor's power, as the faithful drew strength from their belief. And with each miracle, with each victory achieved through faith rather than reason, Guilliman felt the distance grow between the Imperium he served and the Imperium his father had envisioned. The religion that should not exist had become the Imperium's greatest strength, and that fact terrified Guilliman almost as much as what his father had become. What awakening could mean. With this understanding of both the Emperor's transformation and the Imperium's religious nature, we can begin to explore the heart of Guilliman's fear. What would happen if the Emperor somehow awakened from the Golden Throne? What form would such an awakening take? And what would it mean for the Imperium and for humanity itself? The first and most immediate consequence would be catastrophic. The Emperor currently performs multiple functions that are essential to the Imperium's survival. He powers the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows ships to navigate the warp. Without the Astronomicon, interstellar travel becomes exponentially more dangerous and difficult, potentially fragmenting the Imperium into isolated systems. He also maintains the psychic seal on the breached webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace, preventing an endless tide of demons from pouring into the throne room and potentially into Terra itself. If the Emperor were to somehow leave the Golden Throne, even temporarily, both of these functions would cease. The Astronomicon would go dark, stranding countless ships in the warp and leaving navigators blind. The webway breach would reopen, requiring someone else to take the Emperor's place on the throne, or allowing Terra itself to be consumed by demonic invasion. The Imperium would face immediate existential crisis, even before considering what an awakened Emperor might actually do. Some theories suggest that the Emperor's psychic power has grown so vast that he no longer needs the Golden Throne, that it has become more prison than life support. This is the basis of the Star Child theory, which proposes that the Emperor's soul has been slowly separating from his physical body over the millennia, growing in the warp like the Chaos Gods themselves. According to this theory, if the Emperor's body were to die, his soul would be fully released into the Immaterium, where it would become a god of order and reason to oppose the Chaos Gods directly. But this raises terrifying questions. What kind of god would the Emperor become? The Chaos Gods are formed from emotion and belief, from the collective psychic weight of every act of violence, despair, desire, and scheming in the galaxy. They are the distilled essence of sentient suffering and passion, given form and consciousness in the warp. If the Emperor becomes a god through similar processes, what would he embody? The answer suggested by recent events is not comforting. The emperor would be a god of order, certainly, but also of tyranny, of absolute control, of the ruthless sacrifice of the individual for the collective good. He would be the manifestation of humanity's desperate need for survival, of its willingness to do anything, no matter how cruel, to continue existing. This god would love humanity as a whole, while caring nothing for individual humans. It would see all living things as pieces on a board, to be preserved or sacrificed as strategy required. Such an entity would be in some ways better than the chaos gods. It would not seek to corrupt or destroy for its own sake. It would work to preserve humanity and expand its influence. But it would also be utterly without mercy, without compassion, without anything that might slow its pursuit of victory. The emperor had been cold and calculating during the Great Crusade. An apotheosized emperor, transformed into a warp god, would be magnitudes more ruthless. Guilliman had glimpsed something of this in the Plague Wars. When he had been mortally wounded by the Godblight, a plague crafted by Nurgle specifically to kill a Primarch, he had felt the Emperor's presence more clearly than at any time since leaving the throne room. The Emperor had intervened, had used his power to burn the corruption from Guilliman's body, saving his son's life when all other remedies had failed. It was one of the few times the Emperor had shown any kind of care for Guilliman as an individual. But even that intervention had felt wrong. The power that had healed Guilliman was vast and terrible, a force that had little to do with compassion or paternal concern. It had the character of an investment being protected, a valuable asset being maintained. The Emperor had saved Guilliman, not because he cared whether Roboute lived or died, but because a dead Primarch would be less useful than a living one. The mechanical nature of that salvation had been almost worse than dying would have been. In that moment, Guilliman had also sensed something else, a presence in the warp that was growing stronger. The Aeldari, the ancient alien race that had once dominated the galaxy before the birth of Slaanesh, had confirmed what Guilliman suspected. They could see something gestating in the Imperium, a consciousness that was using the Emperor's physical body as an anchor point while it grew in power. This entity fed on the worship of billions of humans, drew strength from their faith and devotion, and was slowly transforming into something that might one day rival the Chaos Gods themselves. But here was the horrifying question. Was this entity actually the Emperor? Or was it something else? Something born from 10,000 years of human worship, wearing the Emperor's identity like a mask? If every prayer to the Emperor, every act of faith, every sacrifice made in his name fed this warp presence, then it was being shaped as much by what humanity believed the Emperor to be, as by what he actually was. And humanity believed the Emperor to be a god of absolute righteousness, of unwavering judgment, of divine wrath against the unclean and the heretic. The thing growing in the warp might have the Emperor's memories, his strategic genius, his fundamental goals for humanity's survival, but it would also have the character of a god shaped by fanatic worship, by 10,000 years of prayers from desperate humans begging for salvation. Such an entity would not be constrained by human weakness or mortality. It would not hesitate to sacrifice worlds, entire sectors, if doing so served the greater goal of humanity's survival. It would be righteousness without mercy, order without compassion, the Emperor's cold rationality magnified to divine proportions. This is what truly terrified Guilliman. Not that the Emperor would awaken and abandon the Imperium, but that he would awaken and transform it into something even more oppressive than it already was. The Emperor of the Great Crusade had at least paid lip service to ideas of human dignity, to building a society where enlightenment and reason could flourish. The being on the Golden Throne had no patience for such niceties. An awakened emperor, transformed into a god, would care only about survival and dominance. The Imperium already sacrificed 1,000 psychers every day to keep the emperor alive. It already maintained a brutal totalitarian regime where dissent was punished with death and entire worlds could be destroyed for minor infractions. It already treated human life as a resource to be expended in service to the state. What would such a system become under the direct rule of a god emperor who viewed all of this as not just acceptable, but necessary? Guilliman had seen too much of the current Imperium to harbor any illusions about what awakening would bring. The ecclesiarchy would view an awakened emperor as the fulfillment of prophecy, as proof that their faith had been justified all along. They would give him absolute power, absolute authority, and he would use it without hesitation or remorse. The age of the Imperium would give way to the age of the God Emperor, and humanity would discover that having an active God was far more terrible than having one who slept. There was also the possibility, whispered in the darkest corners of the Imperium's hierarchy, that an awakened emperor would not be content with ruling humanity alone. His vision had always extended beyond mere survival. He had wanted humanity to evolve, to become a fully psychic race capable of defending itself against chaos and dominating the galaxy. An awakened God Emperor might accelerate that evolution, forcing changes upon humanity that would transform it into something unrecognizable. The Primarchs themselves were proof of concept, genetically engineered demigods who transcended human limitations. The Emperor had created them with his own hands, blending genetic science with warpcraft to produce beings of immense power. If an apotheosized emperor decided to reshape humanity in a similar fashion, would the people he was supposed to protect even count as human anymore? Would they retain their free will, their individuality, or would they become extension of the emperor's will, components of a hive mind dedicated to his grand design? These questions kept Guilliman awake during what few hours he allowed himself for rest. He would lie in his private chambers, staring at the ceiling, wondering what future awaited the Imperium. Every path seemed to lead to darkness. If the Emperor remained on the Golden Throne, the Imperium would continue to slowly decay, gradually losing ground to countless enemies. If the Golden Throne failed and the Emperor died, the Astronomicon would go dark and the Imperium would fragment into chaos. If the Emperor awakened, something even more terrible might take direct control of human civilization. And underlying all of this was a more personal fear. What would an awakened emperor do with his Primarch sons? Guilliman had already discovered that the emperor viewed him as a tool, as an implement rather than a son. Would an apotheosized emperor even acknowledge that relationship? Or would he simply conscript Guilliman into service with all the warmth of a general requisitioning supplies? The emperor had shown no hesitation in the past about sacrificing his sons when necessary. Ferrus Manus had died at Istvan. Sanguinius had been allowed to sacrifice himself, fighting Horus. How many more Primarchs would the Emperor be willing to spend if he decided it served his goals? Guilliman realized that he feared not just for the Imperium, but for himself. He had spent 10,000 years in stasis, escaping the horror and madness of the age. Now he had been pulled back into a nightmare that exceeded anything he could have imagined, and at the center of that nightmare was his own father, transformed into something that might not even recognize the concept of paternal feeling. The hypocrisy of gods. Perhaps the most philosophically troubling aspect of the Emperor's situation was the sheer hypocrisy it represented. The Emperor had built his entire crusade on the rejection of religious belief, on the principle that humanity must cast aside superstition and embrace reason. He had destroyed countless civilizations for clinging to their gods. He had humiliated his own son for spreading belief in his divinity. The imperial truth had been absolute. There were no gods worthy of worship, only natural phenomena that science had not yet explained. And now, the Emperor himself was becoming a god, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, but literally transforming into a warp entity that derived power from worship and belief. The very thing he had fought against, The very corruption he had sought to eliminate had consumed him. The Emperor had become what he had always claimed to despise. This was not lost on Guilliman. Every time he encountered the imperial cult, every time he witnessed the fervor of true believers, he felt the weight of this cosmic irony. The Emperor had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. Wrong about religion being purely a force for division. Wrong about faith having no value against chaos. Wrong about gods being nothing but primitive superstition. The Emperor's cold rationality had led him to misunderstand fundamental truths about the nature of the warp and human psychology. Worse still, the Emperor had known about the dangers of the warp from the beginning. He had bargained with the Chaos Gods to gain the power to create the Primarchs, or so some whispered. He had studied the Imperium extensively, had understood its dangers better than almost anyone. And yet he had chosen to keep that knowledge secret, to lie to his own sons about the true nature of chaos, believing that ignorance would protect them better than understanding. That decision had proven catastrophically wrong. The Primarchs who fell to chaos did so, in part, because they had not been prepared for the reality of the warp's influence. Magnus the Red had made his fatal mistake because he did not understand the price of delving too deep into forbidden knowledge. Horus had been vulnerable to corruption because he did not recognize the signs when Erebus and the other Chaos agents began their work. The Emperor's lies, meant to protect his sons, had instead left them defenseless. Guilliman wondered sometimes if the entire Horus heresy could have been prevented if the Emperor had simply told the truth from the beginning. If the Primarchs had known about chaos, if they had been trained to recognize its influence and resist its temptations, would Horus still have fallen? Would Lorgar still have sought the approval of the Dark Gods? The counterfactual was unknowable, but Guilliman suspected that honesty might have saved billions of lives and prevented the Imperium from transforming into the theocratic nightmare it had become. The Emperor's transformation into a god represented the ultimate triumph of faith over reason, of the irrational over the rational. Everything the Emperor had claimed about the superiority of science and logic had been proven wrong by his own metamorphosis. He was becoming a god, not through reason, not through superior understanding, but through the raw power of belief, through millions of humans praying to him, worshipping him, offering their faith. The very mechanism he had rejected was now sustaining and transforming him. And yet, even knowing this, the Emperor had apparently made no effort to stop it. He could not, of course, actively prevent humans from worshipping him, but he had made no attempt to communicate to the Imperium that such worship was unwanted or counterproductive. The ecclesiarchy had grown for 10 millennia without any divine rebuke, without any sign that the Emperor disapproved of their devotion. This could be interpreted as tacit acceptance, or even approval. Had the Emperor changed his mind about the value of faith? Had 10,000 years on the Golden Throne taught him that his philosophical framework had been flawed? Or was he simply too far gone, too consumed by the necessities of survival, to care about the ideological consistency of his followers? Guilliman had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was itself disturbing. The other aspect of this hypocrisy was what it revealed about the Emperor's true character. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor had positioned himself as a beacon of enlightenment, bringing reason and understanding to a galaxy mired in ignorance. But beneath that facade had been a being of immense pragmatism, willing to use any tool, including his own sons, to achieve his goals. The Emperor had not rejected religion because he found it philosophically distasteful. He had rejected it because he believed it would be a barrier to human evolution and unity. Now that religion had proven useful, even necessary, the Emperor seemed perfectly willing to benefit from it. The worship that he had once condemned was now sustaining him, feeding his transformation into a god. This suggested that the Emperor's principles had always been negotiable, subordinate to the larger goal of humanity's survival. He would embrace whatever philosophy, whatever practice, whatever sacrifice served that purpose, regardless of how it contradicted his previous statements. Guilliman had been raised to value consistency, to believe that principles mattered, that actions should align with stated beliefs. The Emperor's apparent willingness to abandon his own philosophical framework, when it became inconvenient, struck at the heart of everything Guilliman thought he understood about his father. If the Emperor's rejection of religion had been merely tactical, if the imperial truth had been just another tool rather than a genuine belief, then what else had been a lie? What other principles had the Emperor discarded when they no longer served his needs? This question extended beyond mere philosophy. It touched on the fundamental relationship between the Emperor and his Primarch sons. The Emperor had told them they were his sons, had used the language of family and paternal connection. But if that too was tactical, if the Emperor had simply adopted whatever emotional framework would ensure his son's loyalty, then the entire foundation of that relationship was false. Guilliman was forced to confront the possibility that nothing the Emperor had ever told him was meant to be taken at face value, that every word, every gesture, every expression of pride or disappointment had been calculated for its effect, rather than reflecting genuine feeling. This realization cut deeper than the discovery that the Emperor did not love his sons. Lack of love was simply absence, a void where affection should have been, but deception was active, deliberate, a choice to manipulate rather than engage honestly. If the Emperor had been lying about his beliefs, his goals, perhaps even his own nature, then the Primarchs had never truly known their father. They had known only the mask he wore, the performance he gave, the role he played to keep them loyal and useful. The tragedy was that Horus had been partially right. The War Master's fall to chaos had been precipitated by his belief that the Emperor was betraying him, using him, and discarding him once his usefulness had ended. The truth was more complex than Horus had understood at the time, but the core insight had been valid. The Emperor did view his sons as tools. He was willing to sacrifice them when necessary, and while he had not been ascending to godhood during the heresy, he had apparently had no objection to doing so afterward. Lorgar had also been right, though in a way that would probably not bring him satisfaction. The word-bearer's Primarch had insisted that the Emperor was worthy of worship, that he was something more than human. The Emperor had rejected this claim, had punished Lorgar for making it. But time had proven Lorgar's belief correct. The Emperor was transforming into something that transcended humanity, something that could legitimately be called divine. Lorgar's faith had been vindicated, even if Lorgar himself had long since transferred that faith to different gods. Guilliman found himself in the uncomfortable position of being one of the few people in the galaxy who understood this cosmic joke. He knew that the Emperor had rejected worship. He knew that the Imperial cult represented everything the Emperor had fought against. He knew that the Emperor's transformation into a god was the ultimate betrayal of his own principles. And yet, he could not reveal this knowledge, could not share this understanding, because doing so would undermine the very structure that held the Imperium together. The hypocrisy was built into the system. The Imperium survived because of a lie that contradicted its founder's beliefs. The Emperor's power grew because of worship he had once condemned. And Guilliman, tasked with leading this Imperium, had to perpetuate the lie, even though he knew it for what it was. He had to allow the prayers to continue, had to tolerate the ecclesiarchy's excesses, had to stand by while billions of humans devoted their lives to serving a god who had explicitly rejected their devotion. This was perhaps the most bitter aspect of his service. Guilliman had always prided himself on his rationality, his commitment to truth and logic. Now he was forced to become a guardian of the most profound untruth in human history. He had to protect a lie because the truth would be too destructive to bear. And every day that he did so, every moment that he allowed the worship to continue, he felt himself becoming complicit in the very hypocrisy he despised. A tool, not a son. The realization that the Emperor viewed his Primarchs as tools rather than sons was not, in itself, surprising to Guilliman. He had always understood that he was created for a purpose, that his existence served the Emperor's larger plans. The Primarchs were weapons, crafted to lead the Great Crusade, and bring humanity's scattered worlds back into a unified empire. Their genetic engineering, their enhanced capabilities, their very personalities had been designed with specific roles in mind. This was simply fact, not a revelation that required emotional processing. What cut so deeply was not the knowledge itself, but the manner in which it had been conveyed. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor had at least maintained the pretense of paternal relationship. He had called the Primarchs his sons, had shown what appeared to be pride in their accomplishments, had seemed to care about their well-being beyond their utility. This pretense, shallow as it might have been, had provided a framework for the Primarchs' loyalty, a sense that they were valued not just for what they could do, but for who they were. The encounter at the Golden Throne had stripped away that pretense completely. The Emperor had not acknowledged Guilliman as a son, had not expressed relief at his return, had not shown any emotional response to their reunion. Guilliman had been assessed, found functional, and given orders. The transaction had been purely utilitarian, devoid of any warmth or recognition of their relationship. It was the psychic equivalent of a mechanic checking a machine's functionality before putting it back to work. This was what haunted Guilliman more than perhaps anything else. Not that his father had never loved him, but that his father had never even seen him as a discreet person worthy of such feeling. The Emperor had looked at Guilliman and seen Primarch 13, genetic template for the Ultramarines, optimized for administration and logistics, currently required for command of Imperial forces in the era Indomitus. Everything that made Reboot Guilliman an individual, his thoughts, his hopes, his experiences, his sacrifices, was irrelevant to the Emperor's assessment. Only his function mattered. Guilliman found himself wondering about his brothers, both loyal and traitor. Had they all experienced this same cold assessment? When Sanguinius had stood before the Emperor, had he been acknowledged as a beloved son, or simply evaluated for his combat effectiveness? When Dawn had reported on his fortification of the Imperial Palace, had the Emperor expressed genuine appreciation or merely confirmed that the tool was performing its assigned task? The more Guilliman thought about his brothers' relationships with the Emperor, the more he suspected that they had all been subjected to the same utilitarian treatment, though most had not lived long enough to have it made so brutally explicit. The traitor Primarchs might have understood this truth better than the loyal ones. Horus had turned to chaos in part because he felt the Emperor had used him and then cast him aside. Perturabo had always believed himself undervalued, given the worst assignments because the Emperor did not appreciate his abilities. Mortarion had resented the Emperor's manipulation of his recruitment to the Great Crusade. All of them had, in various ways, sensed that their father viewed them as means to an end rather than as sons deserving of love and respect. The tragic irony was that Guilliman had been one of the Primarchs most comfortable with this utilitarian relationship. Unlike some of his brothers, he had not craved the Emperor's affection. He had understood that he existed to serve, that his value lay in his capabilities rather than in any personal connection. Guilliman had taken pride in being useful, in accomplishing the tasks assigned to him, in meeting and exceeding the Emperor's expectations. The professional nature of their relationship had suited him well. But there was a difference between accepting a professional relationship and discovering that even the pretense of anything more had been a calculated performance. Guilliman could have accepted being valued primarily for his utility. What he struggled with was the revelation that the Emperor did not value him at all in any other context, that Reboot Guilliman as an individual was essentially invisible to his creator. The Emperor saw only the function, never the person performing it. This understanding cast new light on many events from the Great Crusade and the Heresy. When the Emperor had returned to Terra to work on the Webway project, leaving the Primarchs to continue the crusade without his direct supervision, he had not been abandoning them or betraying their trust. He had simply been redeploying his assets, confident that the tools he had built were capable of operating independently. The Primarch's feelings about this decision, their sense of loss or betrayal, would not have factored into the Emperor's calculations, except insofar as those feelings might affect their performance. Similarly, when the Emperor had ordered Guilliman to accompany him to Monarchia for Lorgar's censure, he had not been inviting a trusted son to witness an important event. He had been deploying Guilliman as a symbol, using his presence to reinforce the message that Lorgar's religious practices were rejected even by his brothers. Guilliman's own beliefs about religion, his agreement with the Emperor's position, were relevant only because they made him an effective tool for that particular demonstration. Even the Emperor's apparent favoritism towards certain primarchs, which had caused so much resentment among others, took on a different character in this light. The Emperor had not loved Horus more than his other sons. He had simply found Horus to be the most broadly capable, the one whose combination of martial prowess, charisma, and tactical acumen made him suitable for the role of Warmaster. When that tool became corrupted and turned against its creator, the Emperor had been willing to destroy it despite whatever affection he might have once displayed. The love had been performance, only the utility was real. Guilliman could not help but compare this relationship to his own experiences with Connor, his adoptive father, on Macragge. Connor had been a mortal man, limited by human lifespan and capabilities, but he had genuinely cared for Roboute as a son. Their relationship had included expectations and duties, certainly, but it had also included warmth, guidance offered out of love rather than calculation, pride that stemmed from genuine paternal affection. When Connor had died defending Macragge from Galen's treachery, Guilliman had mourned not just a mentor, but a true father. The Emperor could never be that kind of father. His perspective was too vast, his goals too cosmic, his very nature too alien to human emotional connection. He had lived for 40,000 years, had seen civilizations rise and fall, had witnessed suffering on scales that would drive lesser beings mad. Somewhere in that long existence, he had apparently burned away the capacity for personal attachment, or perhaps had never possessed it in the first place. The Emperor loved humanity as an abstraction, as a project, as something to be guided and protected and ultimately elevated. But he could not love individual humans, not even the genetically engineered demigods he had crafted from his own genetic material. This explained so much about the Emperor's behavior, his lies, his manipulations, his apparent inconsistencies. None of it was inconsistent when viewed through the lens of someone managing resources rather than relating to people. The Emperor told whatever lies served his purposes, maintained whatever pretenses ensured loyalty, displayed whatever emotions would motivate his followers. It was all performance, all tactics, all in service of the grand strategy. There was no true self beneath the mask, because the mask was all that was needed to achieve his goals. Guilliman wrestled with what this meant for his own sense of identity and purpose. If he had been created purely as a tool, if his entire existence was meant to serve the Emperor's plans, then what was he beyond that function? His genetic code, his enhanced capabilities, even his personality had been engineered. The traits that made him an effective administrator and military commander were not accidents of nature, but deliberate design choices. In a very real sense, Guilliman had never been free to become anything other than what the Emperor had intended him to be. And yet, he was aware of making choices, of having thoughts and feelings that seemed to go beyond mere programming. He could disagree with the Emperor's methods even while serving his goals. He could feel anger at being treated as a tool while still acknowledging the tactical necessity of that treatment. He could mourn the father-son relationship that had never truly existed. These responses suggested some degree of autonomy, some core of selfhood that transcended his designed function. Or perhaps even that autonomy was part of the design. The Primarchs needed to be capable of independent thought and action, needed to be able to adapt to unexpected situations and make command decisions without constant oversight. Creating them as pure automatons would have made them less effective. So perhaps the Emperor had deliberately built in the capacity for independence, knowing that it carried risks, but calculating that those risks were acceptable given the enhanced capability it provided. This philosophical uncertainty was its own form of torture. Guilliman could not know whether his thoughts were truly his own or simply the product of sophisticated programming. He could not determine whether his resentment of being treated as a tool was a genuine emotional response or merely a designed reaction meant to maintain the illusion of autonomy. The Emperor had created him, had shaped every aspect of his being, and in doing so, had made it impossible for Guilliman to ever fully trust his own consciousness. The practical implications of this reality were equally disturbing. If Guilliman was fundamentally a tool, then the Emperor would have no qualms about using him, sacrificing him, or discarding him when his utility ended. The Emperor had already demonstrated this with other Primarchs. Ferrus Manus had died at Istvan V. Sanguinius had sacrificed himself fighting Horus. The Emperor had allowed both deaths to occur, had factored them into his larger calculations, had apparently felt no more grief over their loss than a general might feel over lost soldiers. What fate awaited Guilliman then? He was currently useful, serving as the Imperial Regent and leading the Imperium through one of its darkest hours. But what would happen when the current crisis passed? What would happen if another Primarch returned, one the Emperor deemed more suitable for leadership? Would Guilliman be reassigned to some other duty, stored away like a weapon in an armory, or simply disposed of if he had outlived his usefulness? The most terrifying possibility was that an awakened Emperor would not even recognize these questions as valid. To ask what would happen to Guilliman would be like asking what would happen to a hammer after it finished driving nails. The hammer would either be used for another task or put away for later use. Its own preferences or desires in the matter were irrelevant. An awakened Emperor would view Guilliman in exactly that light, as an implement whose feelings about its deployment did not factor into the decision-making process. This was what Guilliman feared on a personal level. Not death itself, which he had faced countless times, but being reduced to pure function, being acknowledged only as a tool, while everything that made him Roboute Guilliman was dismissed as irrelevant. He had spent his entire existence serving the Emperor's vision, had sacrificed everything to build and defend the Imperium, had endured 10,000 years of death-like stasis, and the reward for all of that service was the knowledge that his father did not see him as a person deserving of recognition, only as a mechanism performing its designated task, the political tightrope. Beyond the personal and philosophical dimensions of his fear, Guilliman faced practical political considerations that made the prospect of an awakened emperor deeply problematic. As the Imperial Regent, Guilliman occupied a unique position in the Imperium's hierarchy. He wielded enormous power, commanding the loyalty of the Adeptus Astartes, respected by the Adeptus Custodes, and acknowledged even by the High Lords of Terror as having authority that superseded their own in many matters. This power derived from multiple sources: his status as a Primarch, his historical role in founding the Imperium's current structure, and the perception that he spoke with the Emperor's authority. But that power was also precarious, dependent on maintaining a delicate balance among the Imperium's various factions. The ecclesiarchy tolerated Guilliman despite his obvious discomfort with the imperial cult, because he was a Primarch, a holy son of the god Emperor himself. To move openly against him would be heresy of the highest order. But this protection was conditional. If Guilliman were to actively oppose the imperial cult, to preach the imperial truth, or attempt to restore secular governance, the ecclesiarchy would face a terrible choice: acknowledge a Primarch as a heretic or defend a faith the Primarch himself rejected. The Inquisition represented another source of potential conflict. Many inquisitors were deeply devout members of the imperial cult, viewing the emperor as divine and interpreting his will through their investigations and judgments. Guilliman's skepticism about the emperor's divinity, his clear preference for reason over faith, put him at odds with the philosophical foundations of much of the Inquisition's work. They could not move against him openly, but individual inquisitors and their factions watched him carefully, looking for signs of heresy or corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus presented a different sort of challenge. The priests of Mars worshipped the machine god and the Omnissiah, viewing the Emperor as the Omnissiah's avatar, but maintaining their own distinct religious traditions. They had survived the rise of the imperial cult by establishing a compromise with the ecclesiarchy, agreeing that the Emperor was divine while maintaining their own theological framework. Guilliman's attempts at reform, his efforts to accelerate technological development and reduce superstition within the Mechanicus, threatened this comfortable arrangement. Even the Space Marine chapters, theoretically loyal to Guilliman as his genetic descendants or as brothers in arms, could not be counted on for unconditional support. Many chapters had developed their own traditions and beliefs over 10 millennia, some of them deeply influenced by the imperial cult. The Black Templars, for instance, venerated the Emperor as a god and conducted crusades in his name with religious fervor. If Guilliman were to demand that they abandon such beliefs, their loyalty to him would be tested against their faith. Guilliman navigated these political realities by maintaining careful ambiguity about his own beliefs. He did not publicly deny the Emperor's divinity, though he refused to affirm it. He worked with the ecclesiarchy when necessary, while also quietly supporting reformist elements within their ranks. He used his authority as imperial regent to implement changes gradually, framing them in terms of military necessity rather than ideological conviction. It was exhausting, frustrating work, requiring constant vigilance to avoid triggering the very conflicts that would tear the Imperium apart. An awakened emperor would shatter this careful balance. Whatever form the Emperor's awakening took, it would force the Imperium to confront questions that Guilliman had been able to avoid through ambiguity. Is the Emperor actually divine? Should the imperial cult be maintained or dismantled? What authority do the various imperial institutions possess, and how does it relate to the Emperor's direct rule? These were not abstract theological questions, but practical political issues that would determine the Imperium's future structure. The most optimistic scenario would be that an awakened emperor would validate some combination of the current system, allowing the imperial cult to continue while also implementing reforms to make the Imperium more efficient. But this seemed unlikely, given what Guilliman knew of his father's character. The Emperor had been intolerant of inefficiency during the Great Crusade, had demanded absolute loyalty and obedience, had shown no patience for institutions that did not serve his purposes. An awakened emperor would likely seek to reshape the Imperium according to his will, sweeping away centuries of accumulated tradition and custom. This would necessarily involve confronting the ecclesiarchy. Would the emperor acknowledge his own divinity, validating the faith of billions while contradicting everything he had claimed during the Great Crusade? Or would he attempt to restore the imperial truth, demanding that the ecclesiarchy disband and that humanity abandon its worship of him? Either choice would trigger massive upheaval. The first would vindicate Lorgar and the Word-bearer's original faith, while devastating those who had believed in the Emperor's essential humanity. The second would create a religious crisis that might fragment the Imperium more thoroughly than any external enemy could. Guilliman suspected that the truth would be even more complicated and disturbing. An awakened emperor might not care about ideological consistency or the feelings of his followers. He might simply impose whatever system he calculated to be most effective for humanity's survival and dominance, regardless of how it contradicted his previous statements or what it revealed about his true nature. The Emperor had always been pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. That quality, magnified by godlike power, would make him impossible to predict or constrain. There was also the question of what would happen to Guilliman himself in the event of the Emperor's awakening. Currently, he served as the Emperor's voice and hand, interpreting his will and implementing it across the Imperium. This role gave Guilliman enormous influence, allowing him to shape the Imperium's direction while claiming to follow the Emperor's guidance. An awakened emperor would eliminate the need for such interpretation, Guilliman would become redundant, a primarch without portfolio, his authority superseded by his father's direct rule. Would the emperor allow Guilliman to continue serving as imperial regent, or would he reassign his son to some other duty, perhaps sending him to the Imperium's frontiers to command military campaigns, while the emperor handled governance directly? The second option seemed more likely, given what Guilliman understood of his father's character. The emperor would want to manage the Imperium personally, would trust no one else with decisions of genuine importance, would see Guilliman as most valuable in a military command role. This demotion would not necessarily be presented as such. The emperor would likely frame it as freeing Guilliman to focus on what he does best, or redeploying assets for maximum efficiency. But Guilliman would understand the reality. He was being removed from positions where his thoughts and opinions might influence policy, reduced to a role where his only responsibility was executing orders. The tool would be returned to its intended use after a period of being employed for purposes beyond its designed function. The political structures that Guilliman had carefully maintained would also be at risk. He had worked to create a more functional relationship between the High Lords of Terror, had attempted to reduce corruption within the administratum, had sought to make the Imperium's bureaucracy less ossified and more responsive to threats. These reforms were incomplete, often blocked by institutional resistance, but they represented movement toward a more rational system of governance. An awakened emperor might sweep all of this away, implementing his own vision of how the Imperium should be structured, regardless of what Guilliman or anyone else thought. 10,000 years of institutional development, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, would be dismissed as irrelevant. The emperor would rebuild from first principles, reorganizing everything according to his strategic calculations. The result might be more efficient, but it would also be more tyrannical, with less room for the kind of local autonomy and institutional independence that Guilliman believed were essential for a realm as vast as the Imperium. Most troubling of all was the possibility that an awakened emperor would implement changes that Guilliman found morally repugnant. The emperor had always been willing to sacrifice individuals for the greater good, to make terrible choices in service of humanity's survival. But there were limits to what even Guilliman, pragmatic as he was, could accept. If the emperor ordered the extinction of entire populations for strategic purposes, if he implemented breeding programs to accelerate human evolution regardless of individual consent, if he treated human beings as nothing more than raw material to be shaped according to his grand design, what would Guilliman do? The answer was terrifying in its implications. Guilliman would probably obey, not because he agreed with such measures, but because he had no other options. He could not oppose the emperor directly. Doing so would make him a traitor, would align him with the forces of chaos and destruction that he had spent his entire existence fighting. He could not abandon his post. The Imperium needed effective leadership too desperately for him to indulge in the luxury of moral resignation. He would be forced to implement policies he despised, to become complicit in actions that violated everything he believed about human dignity and worth. This prospect was almost worse than death. Guilliman could face his own mortality with equanimity. He had come close to dying countless times, and he understood that all warriors must eventually fall. But to live on as the instrument of policies that betrayed his fundamental values, to be the emperor's hand in reshaping humanity into something he might not recognize or respect, that was a fate he genuinely feared. The political dimensions of an awakened emperor thus reinforced and amplified the personal and philosophical fears that haunted Guilliman. It was not just that his father might not love him, or that the Imperium might become even more oppressive, or that the emperor's transformation into a god contradicted everything Guilliman had been taught to believe. It was that all of these things would intersect in ways that left Guilliman powerless, trapped between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his own conscience, forced to participate in a transformation of humanity that he could neither stop nor accept. Evidence of the divine. Despite his rational skepticism and his knowledge of the emperor's rejection of worship, Guilliman could not completely dismiss the evidence that something divine was at work in the Imperium. The age he had awakened into was one of miracles and wonders that defied purely materialistic explanation. The power of faith, the reality of saints, the Emperor's direct intervention in critical moments, all suggested that whatever was happening with the Emperor transcended simple psychic phenomenon. The most dramatic example had occurred during the Plague Wars. Guilliman had been struck down by the Godblight, a plague crafted by Nurgle himself, specifically to kill a Primarch. This was not a natural disease, or even an ordinary warp-spawned pestilence. It was a direct creation of a chaos god, imbued with power that could corrupt and destroy even a genetically enhanced demigod. No medical intervention could cure it. The apothecaries had tried everything in their considerable arsenal, and nothing had slowed the plague's progression. Guilliman had been dying, his enhanced physiology overwhelmed by corruption that ate at his very essence. And then the Emperor had intervened, not subtly, not indirectly through some chain of cause and effect, but directly and unmistakably. A golden light had filled Guilliman's vision, and he had felt his father's presence more clearly than at any time since the throne room encounter. The power that burned through him was vast and terrible, a purifying fire that consumed the Godblight completely, driving out Nurgle's corruption and restoring Guilliman to health. The experience had been traumatic in its own way. The Emperor's power felt inhuman, alien, more like being struck by a star's corona than like receiving healing from a caring parent. But it had undeniably saved Guilliman's life, and it had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond what the Emperor had possessed during the Great Crusade. This was not the work of an extremely powerful psyker. This was divine intervention, the act of a being whose power and nature had transcended mortal limitations. Guilliman had also witnessed the living saints, individuals who embodied the Emperor's will and power in ways that defied rational explanation. Saint Celestine was the most prominent, a warrior who had died and been resurrected multiple times, who fought with abilities that exceeded even those of Space Marines, who radiated an aura of faith that inspired those around her and drove demons into retreat. She claimed to be the Emperor's servant, a vessel for his will, and her actions supported that claim. The skeptic in Guilliman wanted to explain these phenomena as purely psychic in nature. Perhaps the saints were powerful psychers whose abilities manifested in ways that appeared miraculous to observers. Perhaps the Emperor's intervention during the Godblight had been a sophisticated application of psychic healing techniques made possible by the Emperor's enhanced state. Perhaps all of this could be understood through a materialistic framework that did not require accepting the existence of actual divinity. But Guilliman had to admit, at least to himself, that such explanations felt incomplete. The power he had witnessed, the transformations he had seen, the sheer weight of faith's influence on reality, all pointed towards something more than psychic ability. The Emperor was not simply a very powerful psyker who happened to be worshipped. He was actively being transformed by that worship, his nature changing in response to the beliefs and prayers of billions of humans. This was not how psykers worked. This was how gods worked. The Eldari had confirmed this to some degree. They could perceive the warp more clearly than humans, could see the patterns of psychic energy that humans could only sense indirectly, and they reported seeing something vast gestating in the Imperium, a consciousness that fed on faith and grew stronger with each passing year. The Eldari, who had created a god through their own actions, albeit a terrible one in Slaanesh, recognized the process. The Emperor was undergoing apotheosis, transforming from a powerful mortal into a genuine warp entity. This created a philosophical crisis for Guilliman. If the Emperor was truly becoming a god, then the core principles of the imperial truth were false. There were gods, or at least beings so powerful and so fundamentally different from mortals that calling them gods was not meaningfully incorrect. The Emperor's rejection of worship during the Great Crusade had been either a lie or a mistake, an ideological position that contradicted the actual nature of reality. More troubling still was what this implied about Lorgar. The the word-bearer's Primarch, had always insisted that faith was humanity's greatest strength, that worship of the Emperor was not only appropriate, but necessary. He had been punished for these beliefs, forced to watch Monarchia burn, humiliated before his entire legion. And now it turned out that Lorgar had been right all along. Faith was powerful. The Emperor was becoming a god. The worship that Lorgar had championed had sustained the Emperor and was now transforming him into something that transcended mortality. Guilliman hated admitting this even to himself. Lorgar was a traitor, a servant of chaos, one of the architects of the Horus heresy. The idea that Lorgar might have been correct about anything felt like a betrayal of everything Guilliman believed. But the evidence was undeniable. Lorgar had understood something fundamental about the nature of belief and reality that the Emperor had either missed or deliberately concealed. This raised the question, what else had Lorgar been right about? The word-bearer had always claimed that the Emperor lied, that his rejection of divinity was itself a form of deception meant to test the faith of his followers. At the time, this had seemed like the delusion of a desperate traitor trying to justify his own fall. But if the Emperor had been lying about not being worthy of worship, what other lies might he have told? Had he lied about chaos, about the Primarch's purpose, about his own intentions for humanity's future? Guilliman found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of having to re-evaluate events from the heresy through this new lens. Lorgar's claim that the Emperor had betrayed him by rejecting his faith took on new dimensions when the Emperor was actively benefiting from the faith-based imperial cult. Horus's accusation that the Emperor was abandoning his sons to pursue godhood looked different when the Emperor was literally transforming into a god. Magnus's argument that the Emperor did not trust his sons with important truths was validated by the revelation that the Emperor had lied about fundamental aspects of reality. This did not excuse what these Primarchs had done. Turning to chaos, betraying the Imperium, murdering their brothers, these were unforgivable acts, regardless of whatever legitimate grievances might have motivated them. But it suggested that the traitor's fall had been facilitated by the Emperor's own deceptions, that perhaps with more honesty and less manipulation, the heresy might never have occurred. The evidence of divine power also forced Guilliman to confront questions about the nature of good and evil. During the Great Crusade, the moral framework had been relatively clear. The Emperor represented reason, progress, and human unity. Chaos represented corruption, madness, and destruction. The mission was to bring the lost worlds of humanity back into the fold while fighting against Xeno's threats and the influence of the warp. Guilliman had been comfortable with this framework, had never questioned whether the cause he served was fundamentally righteous. But now that framework was collapsing. The Emperor was becoming a god, using the same mechanisms that empowered the Chaos gods. He fed on worship, grew stronger through belief, existed as a vast consciousness in the warp. The fact that he represented order rather than chaos did not change the fundamental nature of what he was becoming. And if a god of order was acceptable, if it was right for humanity to worship and empower such an entity, then what exactly was wrong with the Chaos gods? Were they evil because of their nature, or simply because they opposed humanity? Guilliman had no good answers to these questions. The Chaos gods were obviously destructive, obviously inimical to human flourishing. Worshipping them led to corruption, madness, and atrocity. But their existence as warp entities, as beings formed from emotion and belief, was not inherently different from what the Emperor was becoming. The difference lay in their character, in what they represented, and how they influenced their followers. But that difference was one of degree and direction rather than fundamental nature. This suggested that the universe was more complex and morally ambiguous than the imperial truth had acknowledged. There were not clear categories of real and unreal, rational and irrational, truth and superstition. Instead, there were forces that transcended material reality. entities whose existence derived from consciousness and belief rather than physical laws. Some of these forces aligned with human welfare, others opposed it, but all of them were equally real and equally capable of affecting the material universe. The practical implication of this understanding was deeply disturbing. If faith could empower gods, if worship could literally transform a being into a deity, then humanity's beliefs mattered in ways that the imperial truth had never acknowledged. The ecclesiarchy was not simply maintaining a useful fiction or providing psychological comfort. They were actively participating in the emperor's apotheosis, channeling psychic power through their prayers and rituals, shaping the kind of god the emperor would become. This meant that Guilliman could not simply dismiss the imperial cult as irrational nonsense. The faith of billions was having real effects, was contributing to humanity's survival in measurable ways. The miracles were real. The saints were real. The emperor's growing power was real. Rejecting these phenomena because they did not fit into a materialistic worldview would be as irrational as believing in gods without evidence had been. But accepting the reality of divine power did not make Guilliman comfortable with it. The fact that faith could shape reality did not mean that the specific faith being practiced was optimal, or that the god being worshipped would use his power wisely. The emperor was becoming a god not because he sought such transformation, but because billions of humans needed him to be one. Their worship was shaping him, influencing what kind of deity he would become. And the character of that worship, with its emphasis on submission, sacrifice, and rigid hierarchy, was creating a god of absolute order and control. This was perhaps the most frightening aspect of the evidence for divine power. It suggested that the emperor's awakening would not restore the rational, scientific empire of the Great Crusade. Instead, it would usher in an age of divine tyranny, where faith and worship became the primary mechanisms of social control, and where the emperor's will, backed by genuine godlike power, would be utterly unchallengeable. The Imperium was creating its own god, and that god would reflect the character of the society that had created it: brutal, authoritarian, willing to sacrifice individual dignity and freedom for the promise of collective survival. The future, Guilliman fears. With all of this context established, the emperor's transformation, the prevalence of the imperial cult, the reality of divine power, and Guilliman's own position within the Imperium, we can now fully articulate the future that Guilliman fears. It is not a simple fear of change, or even a fear of his father's power. It is a fear of a specific trajectory that he sees the Imperium following, one that leads to a destination that betrays everything he believes the Imperium should represent. In Guilliman's worst-case scenario, the Emperor awakens as a fully realized warp god, his consciousness now completely divorced from human limitations or concerns. This entity would retain the Emperor's intelligence, his strategic genius, his understanding of history, and his long-term goals for humanity. But it would have lost any remaining capacity for compassion, for individual consideration, for the kind of moral reasoning that recognizes the inherent value of human life and dignity. This god-emperor would see the Imperium not as a collection of individual humans worthy of protection and respect, but as a resource to be managed and optimized. Entire worlds would be sacrificed without hesitation if doing so served the larger goal of humanity's survival and dominance. Populations would be forcibly altered, their genetics and even their consciousness reshaped to make them more useful to the Imperium's purposes. The freedom that individual humans still possessed, limited as it was, would be eliminated entirely in favor of a perfectly ordered society where every person existed only to serve the Emperor's will. This transformation would be justified by necessity. The galaxy was a hostile place, filled with threats that could extinguish humanity at any moment. The Tyranids were an existential threat, capable of consuming all life in the galaxy if not stopped. Chaos represented another form of extinction, the corruption and madness that would transform humanity into something unrecognizable. The various Xenos races posed their own dangers. In the face of such threats, the argument would go, humanity could not afford the luxury of individual freedom or dignity. Only absolute unity, absolute obedience, absolute sacrifice could ensure survival. Guilliman recognized the logic behind this argument. He had made similar calculations countless times during his service as a military commander. Sometimes, harsh measures were necessary. Sometimes, individual rights had to be subordinated to collective welfare. But there were limits, lines that should not be crossed, even in the name of survival. A humanity that had lost everything that made it worthy of survival was not truly saved, merely preserved in a form that mocked its original nature. The God Emperor that Guilliman feared would not recognize such limits. It would pursue survival with absolute ruthlessness, eliminating anything that stood in the way of that goal. This would include not just external enemies, but also internal dissent, inefficiency, irrationality, anything that reduced the Imperium's capability to survive and fight. The result would be a society of such crushing oppression that it would make the current Imperium look benign by comparison. The imperial cult would be transformed in this scenario, elevated from a state religion to the sole permitted framework for understanding reality. Faith in the Emperor would not just be encouraged but mandatory, enforced with the full weight of divine authority. Those who questioned the Emperor's divinity or his decisions would not be branded heretics in a figurative sense, but would literally be separated from the Emperor's grace, left vulnerable to corruption and destruction. Belief would become the fundamental requirement for inclusion in human society. This religious transformation would extend to the Space Marines and even the Primarchs. All would be required to acknowledge the Emperor's divinity, to worship him as a god, rather than serving him as sons or loyal soldiers. The distinction that had allowed some Space Marine chapters to maintain their own beliefs while remaining loyal to the Imperium would be eliminated. The Black Templars' religious fervor would become the standard expected of all Space Marines, and those who could not meet that standard would be deemed unfit for service. Guilliman himself would face a terrible choice in this scenario. Would he acknowledge his father's divinity, betraying his own beliefs and the principles he had stood for during the Great Crusade? Or would he refuse, positioning himself as an opponent of the God Emperor and potentially becoming branded as a traitor like his fallen brothers? Neither option was acceptable, yet he would be forced to choose. There was also the question of what other changes an awakened God Emperor might implement. The Primarchs had been created using a combination of genetic engineering and warpcraft, incorporating power from the warp into their fundamental nature. If the Emperor decided to reshape humanity in a similar fashion, to forcibly accelerate human psychic evolution regardless of the cost, what would that mean for the billions of humans who lacked the genetic compatibility for such changes? The Emperor had never hesitated to sacrifice populations when he deemed it necessary. During the Great Crusade, worlds that resisted compliance had been subjected to exterminatus, complete annihilation, as a message to others who might resist. The Emperor had claimed this was necessary, that the long-term goal of human unity justified such brutal measures. An awakened God Emperor, unconstrained by any remaining human hesitation, might decide that whole segments of humanity were incompatible with his vision for the species' future, and eliminate them as casually as a gardener pruning unwanted branches. The Imperium would also likely see the end of any meaningful political diversity or local autonomy. Currently, worlds within the Imperium maintained their own governance structures, their own cultural traditions, their own ways of organizing society, so long as they paid their tithes and remained loyal to the Emperor. This created inefficiency, certainly, but it also allowed for adaptation to local conditions and preserved the diversity that had characterized humanity throughout its history. A God Emperor would view such diversity as wasteful and potentially dangerous. The optimal approach, from a purely strategic perspective, would be to impose a single, unified system of governance across all human worlds. Every planet would be organized according to the same principles, follow the same laws, pursue the same goals. Cultural differences would be minimized or eliminated entirely. The result would be an imperium of perfect uniformity, where no world offered anything unique, and no population possessed its own distinctive character. Guilliman valued diversity more than his reputation suggested. Yes, he believed in standardization for military purposes. That was what the Codex Astartes represented. But he had also recognized during the Great Crusade that different worlds needed different approaches, that what worked on one planet might be counterproductive on another. His own realm of Ultramar had maintained substantial autonomy and had thrived because of it. The idea of reducing all of humanity to perfect uniformity appalled him. The elimination of diversity would extend to ideas and knowledge. During the Great Crusade, innovation had been encouraged within certain bounds. The Mechanicum had been allowed to pursue its research, new technologies had been developed, and understanding of the universe had expanded. In the age of the God Emperor, such innovation might be seen as threatening. If the Emperor's knowledge was perfect and his understanding complete, what need was there for humans to seek new knowledge? Faith would replace curiosity, obedience would replace innovation, and humanity would stagnate intellectually, even as it grew more powerful militarily. This stagnation would ironically fulfill the criticisms that many had leveled against the current Imperium. Critics pointed out that the Imperium of the 41st millennium had lost much of the technical knowledge that had existed during the Dark Age of technology, that it maintained its equipment through ritual and superstition rather than understanding. But an awakened God Emperor would likely make this situation permanent and intentional. Knowledge would be controlled and parceled out according to need. Understanding would be limited to that which served the Emperor's purposes. Humanity would become a species of servants and soldiers, no longer capable of the kind of independent thought that had once driven human achievement. The psychological impact of living under such an entity would be devastating. Currently, humans in the Imperium could at least believe that their sacrifices mattered to someone, that the Emperor appreciated their devotion even if he could not acknowledge it directly. They could maintain the fiction that they were valued by the god they served. But an awakened God Emperor would make brutally clear that individual humans did not matter, that their value lay solely in their utility to the collective. This knowledge, widely disseminated, would crush the human spirit in ways that even the current oppression could not. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this future was that it might actually work. An awakened God Emperor might genuinely succeed in ensuring humanity's survival and dominance. With divine power at his disposal, with perfect unity of purpose across the entire Imperium, with all resources optimally allocated and all threats neutralized with ruthless efficiency, humanity might finally achieve the security that had eluded it for tens of thousands of years. The price would be everything that made humanity worth saving, but from the Emperor's perspective, that price would be acceptable. This was the future that kept Guilliman awake during the few hours he allowed himself for rest. Not a future where humanity was destroyed by its enemies, but one where it triumphed at the cost of its own soul. A future where every human became little more than a cell in a vast organism, conscious but not truly alive, existing only to serve purposes they could not understand or question. A future where the Emperor's dream of guiding humanity to greatness was achieved by transforming humanity into something that bore only a superficial resemblance to what it had once been. And Guilliman would have to help build that future. As a Primarch, as the Imperial Regent, as one of the Emperor's most capable sons, he would be instrumental in implementing whatever changes the God Emperor decreed. He would issue the orders that reorganized society, that eliminated diversity, that transformed free humans into obedient servants. He would see the horror in people's eyes as they realized what was being done to them, and he would continue anyway, because refusing would make things worse, would brand him as a traitor and eliminate any possibility of moderating the Emperor's decrees. This was perhaps the deepest layer of Guilliman's fear. Not just that the future would be terrible, but that he would be complicit in making it so. He would become an architect of a nightmare, a builder of the very tyranny he despised. And he would do it because he had no other choice, because the alternatives were all worse, because sometimes the only paths available led to darkness. The burden of knowledge. Guilliman's burden was unique among all the beings in the Imperium. He was one of the few who truly understood what was happening, who could see the trajectory the Emperor was following, and comprehend what it would mean for humanity's future. The vast majority of the Imperium's citizens were ignorant of these realities. They believed in the Emperor as a benevolent god watching over them, protecting them from harm, caring about their welfare. They had no idea that the entity they worshipped viewed them with the same warmth an administrator might feel towards statistics on a data slate. The Space Marines, including even the most intelligent and thoughtful among them, did not fully grasp the situation. They understood that the Emperor was powerful and that he demanded obedience, but they did not comprehend the true nature of his transformation or what an awakening would entail. Most still thought of him as the great leader from the days of the Great Crusade, temporarily incapacitated, but fundamentally unchanged. They could not imagine that their father figure had become something alien, something that barely qualified as conscious in any sense they would recognize. Even the Adeptus Custodes, who stood watch over the Golden Throne and had witnessed the Emperor's deterioration firsthand, did not possess Guilliman's understanding. They saw duty and service where Guilliman saw calculation and ruthless pragmatism. They believed themselves to be honored servants of a master who valued their loyalty, not realizing they were tools maintained because they remained useful. Captain General Valoris was intelligent and observant, but even he could not quite accept that the being they guarded might not see them as anything more than components of a defensive system. The High Lords of Terror wielded enormous power, but understood almost nothing about the true nature of the Imperium they governed. They made decisions based on political considerations, bureaucratic inertia, and personal ambition, never grasping that all of their maneuvering was irrelevant compared to the deeper currents shaping the Imperium's future. When Guilliman met with them, he saw children playing at power while standing at the edge of an abyss they could not perceive. This isolation was psychologically crushing. Guilliman could not share his knowledge with those around him. If he told the Ultramarines that the Emperor did not love his sons, that they were tools to be discarded when their usefulness ended, it would shatter their morale and undermine their effectiveness. If he explained to the Imperial citizens that their god viewed them as statistics rather than individuals, it would destroy the faith that kept them fighting against impossible odds. If he revealed to the ecclesiarchy that their entire belief system was built on contradictions and lies, it would trigger a religious crisis that could fracture the Imperium. So Guilliman remained silent, carrying the burden alone. He attended ceremonies where he was praised as the Emperor's blessed son and said nothing about how that relationship was a fiction. He listened to prayers offered to the Emperor and did not mention that those prayers fed a transformation that the Emperor of the Great Crusade would have found horrifying. He watched miracles occur and did not point out that they validated beliefs the Emperor had once condemned as the most dangerous form of superstition. The loneliness of this knowledge was perhaps as painful as the knowledge itself. Guilliman had always been somewhat isolated by his nature. His rational temperament and focus on efficiency had never made him the most approachable of the Primarchs. But he had at least had brothers he could speak with, peers who understood the unique pressures of being a Primarch. Now, all of his loyal brothers were gone, dead, or missing. The only Primarchs he might encounter would be the traitors, demon princes who had long since abandoned anything approaching human perspective. Even those he trusted most, like Felix the Primaris captain, who served as his equerry, could not truly understand. Felix was intelligent, brave, and dedicated, but he was still a space marine, shaped by 10,000 years of conditioning to view the Emperor with reverence and awe. Guilliman could not burden him with knowledge that would undermine everything Felix believed, especially when that knowledge would not change what needed to be done. So he kept Felix close, but maintained the distance necessary to preserve the secrets he carried. The political necessities of his position added another layer to this isolation. Guilliman had to maintain relationships with factions he fundamentally disagreed with, had to ally with institutions he believed were harmful, had to make compromises that violated his principles. He worked with the ecclesiarchy, despite believing their entire religion was a perversion of his father's intentions. He cooperated with the Inquisition despite their willingness to sacrifice innocence on the mere suspicion of heresy. He accepted support from the Adeptus Mechanicus despite their increasing regression into superstition and ritual. Each compromise chipped away at his sense of self. Guilliman had always prided himself on his integrity, on maintaining his principles, even when doing so was difficult. Now, he was forced to abandon those principles repeatedly, making decisions based purely on pragmatic necessity rather than any coherent moral framework. He told himself this was necessary, that the Imperium's survival required such flexibility, but he could feel himself changing, becoming harder and more cynical with each compromise. There were moments when Guilliman considered simply walking away. He could resign his position as Imperial Regent, could declare that the burden was too great and retreat to Ultramar to govern his own realm. Let someone else navigate the impossible political landscape of the Imperium. Let someone else carry the weight of knowing what the Emperor had become. He had done his part, had served for long enough, had earned the right to rest. But he knew such thoughts were fantasy. The Imperium needed him, or at least needed someone capable of leading with his level of capability. Without a Primarch at the helm, the various factions of the Imperium would tear themselves apart, competing for power. The High Lords could not maintain unity. They were too focused on their own institutional interests. The ecclesiarchy would try to seize control, transforming the Imperium into an even more oppressive theocracy. The military would fracture into competing factions, each claiming to serve the Emperor while pursuing their own agendas. Guilliman was trapped by his own competence and sense of duty. He could see the disasters that would follow his departure, could calculate the likelihood of the Imperium's collapse without strong central leadership. And so he remained, accepting the burden, even as it crushed him, carrying forward, even as he lost faith in the cause he served. The burden included knowing that his fears might be wrong. Perhaps an awakened emperor would not be the tyrannical god entity that Guilliman dreaded. Perhaps the emperor's transformation would restore something of his humanity rather than eliminating what remained. Perhaps the being that emerged from the Golden Throne would find a way to balance his divine nature with genuine care for his followers. Guilliman's entire worldview could be mistaken, his fears baseless, his nightmare vision of the future simply wrong. But Guilliman could not afford to hope for such an outcome. Hope was a luxury for those who did not understand what was at stake. Hope meant preparing for the best case rather than the worst, and that was a gamble Guilliman would not take with humanity's future. Better to assume the worst and be pleasantly surprised than to hope for mercy from an entity that had never demonstrated such a quality. This mindset, necessary as it was, made Guilliman's existence unbearable at times. He lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the moment when the Emperor would awaken and transform the Imperium into the nightmare Guilliman feared. Every day that passed without such an awakening was a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution. Guilliman could not relax, could not truly rest, because he knew that the end he dreaded was always approaching, inevitable and unstoppable. The burden also included responsibility for preparing the Imperium for whatever came next. Guilliman could not prevent the Emperor's awakening, could not stop the process of apotheosis that seemed to be accelerating, but he could try to position the Imperium to survive whatever transformation followed. This meant continuing his reforms despite the resistance they encountered, trying to make the Imperium's institutions more resilient and less dependent on any single individual, even as he knew that an awakened God-Emperor would likely sweep away all such preparations. It meant working to find the missing Primarchs, to bring back other brothers who might share the burden of leadership when the moment came. The Lion, Lemon Russ, Jagatai Khan, any of them who could be found and restored, would provide additional perspectives, additional capabilities, perhaps even alternative paths forward if Guilliman's fears proved justified. But each search came up empty or ended in frustration, leaving Guilliman increasingly convinced that he would face the future alone. It meant training the next generation of leadership, preparing Space Marine commanders and Imperial officials for the possibility that the entire structure of the Imperium might change overnight. But how could he train them for such an eventuality without revealing knowledge that would undermine their effectiveness in the present? How could he prepare them for a future where the Emperor's direct rule might eliminate the need for human judgment and initiative? Most of all, the burden meant continuing to perform his duties with the full weight of this knowledge pressing down on him. Guilliman had to lead battles, make strategic decisions, govern Ultramar, negotiate with the High Lords, all while knowing that everything he built might be swept away in an instant if the Emperor awakened. Every achievement was temporary, every victory conditional, every plan subject to being overturned by a will far greater than his own. This was the final dimension of Guilliman's fear. Not just what would happen if the Emperor awakened, but what it meant to live with the knowledge that such an awakening could occur at any moment. The psychological weight of this burden would have broken a normal human. Even a Space Marine might have cracked under such sustained pressure. Only a Primarch could endure it, and Guilliman sometimes wondered if even that would be enough. He had been designed to be resilient, to withstand pressures that would destroy lesser beings. But his creators had not anticipated this particular form of torture, knowing that your father had become a monster, that your life's work might be destroyed by the one you had served most faithfully, that the future held only the choice between different forms of horror. This was a test of endurance that no genetic engineering could prepare someone for, a burden that had to be carried through will alone. And so, Guilliman carried on, day after day, leading the Imperium through crisis after crisis, while dreading the moment when his father would awaken and transform everything. He maintained the mask of confidence, the appearance of certainty, the projection of strength that those he led required. Inside, he felt himself eroding, losing pieces of who he had been to the relentless pressure of his knowledge and responsibility. This was why Guilliman feared the Emperor's awakening, not because he believed his father was evil, but because he understood too well what his father had become and what that meant for humanity's future. He feared it because he saw too clearly, knew too much, and could not share that knowledge with anyone. He feared it because he was alone in the darkness, the only one who truly understood what awaited, forced to keep fighting while dreading the victory that might spell humanity's final transformation into something unrecognizable. The Emperor's awakening would not bring salvation. It would bring apocalypse of a different kind, one where humanity survived, but at the cost of everything that made its survival meaningful. And Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, would have to watch it happen while playing his part in making it reality. This was his fear, his burden, his nightmare made manifest in the grim darkness of the far future. If you found this exploration of Guilliman's fears fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into Warhammer 40k lore. The universe of the 41st millennium contains endless stories worth exploring, from the tragedy of the Primarchs to the horror of the Imperium's endless wars. Join me as we continue to uncover the dark truths hidden within humanity's crumbling empire, one tale at a time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.